Welcome everyone to this webinar. It's November 30th, and my name is Dan Galpern. I'm the General Counsel and Executive Director of Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative. And with me is Kaylee Martin, who whose magic is responsible for our fabulous website, and she is serving as the co-host for today's webinar. And also with me as a panelist is Don Viviani, who may ask some questions. And Don worked for 30 years as a scientist for the Environmental Protection Agency. And Don and I've known Don now, I guess, for about, I don't know, 5 years or so, Don. And Don is the president of the board of directors of Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative, among other things. In terms of procedure, well, first of all, I want to say thank you for everyone who's joining us. This is a special webinar for CPR Initiative's initial sponsors and supporters. And we have a number of them with us on the internet, including a group of persons from Lionsgate in Voorhees, New Jersey, and then other people scattered throughout the country. If you are having if there are any technical problems with the webinar, you can write in the question and answer toggle on the bottom any problems, and Kaylee will interrupt me so that we can sort anything out. Also, as we proceed, if you have any questions that you want to ensure get to us, you can actually write those questions as well. And Kaylee may well at the end recognize you to ask the question again in your own words. This webinar will be in 3 parts. I'm first going to talk report to you a bit about our Road to the White House No Excuses tour, and secondly about developments in Glasgow with COP26, and then finally a section on what we forward.
Sorry, Dan, you cut out. Could you say that one more time?
Certainly. We're going to proceed in 3 parts in this webinar. The first, I'll talk about a report on what we achieved with our Road to the White House No Excuses tour, which ended in mid-October. And secondly, a little bit about COP26, which I attended in Glasgow, Scotland this month. It was actually October 31 through November 13. And then third, we'll turn to looking at how we can turn things around a bit in the United States with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, and how we intend to attempt to proceed to help make that happen the balance of this year and in all of next year.
Excuse me, Dan?
Yes.
Could you speak a little louder? Some people are having trouble hearing you. Thank you.
Okay. I have the volume all the way up, and I am speaking right into it. So let me think for a second. I don't seem to have any other controls.
You can just keep your volume up. Just keep your voice.
Yeah, or let me put my earphones in and see if that helps. Okay, so those who were having trouble hearing me. If you can hear me better now, or Kaylee, does this sound better, louder?
Yeah, you sound much louder. That's great.
Okay, great. Earphones are the thing. All right. So anyhow, those were just some introductory remarks. And but I also wanted to say thank you so much for those of you who have supported us to date. To date, we have been supported only by individual contributors, and in part that is because we have not gone out to try to secure foundation grants, because we only recently received our IRS determination letter, and so we are now officially a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Contributions to CPR initiative are tax deductible, and also they're actually tax deductible retroactively to the beginning of the year 2020. All right, so and between each of these sections, the Road to the White House No Excuses tour, COP26, and then Turning the Tide, we'll take a 2-minute break to enable you to write in your questions so that you don't have to remember them by the end of the webinar. Our first major initiative, going here to full screen, our first major initiative began back in January of this year. We realized that it would be a tough road to travel to attempt to get something serious through Congress, with given how divided the nation and in particular the Senate was after the last election. And Dr. James Hansen, who is on our board of advisors and who I've been representing for the last 15 years, he's the director of climate science awareness and solutions at Columbia University's Earth Institute, and formerly was the director of the Goddard Institute of Space Studies for NASA. He and I realized that there is existing authority for under which the United States could, if it chose, impose user fees, namely carbon fees on oil, gas, and coal, to, in order to help phase out fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions. And so 5 days after Joe Biden's inauguration, we wrote to the president and explained that there was this existing statutory authority that had never been exercised by the Environmental Protection Agency with respect to fossil fuel emissions. It has been exercised by a number of other federal agencies, but never by the Environmental Protection Agency. And we urged him to direct EPA to utilize this existing authority to serve as a centerpiece of a suite of actions under which the United States could commence the process of decarbonizing our economy. And specifically, we urged that this be done well prior to COP26, which was, as I indicated, was going to commence in November.
I'm sorry, Dan, your screen sharing is not up yet, the PowerPoint that you have.
The PowerPoint is not up?
We just see your face.
Ah, okay. Well, let's see what to do about that. I thought I was sharing the screen the whole time. Okay. Screen sharing.
There we go.
Is anything being shared now?
Yes. Perfect.
Okay, so here was the first thing, the first slide. And then here is the second slide, noting that I'm going to talk about the first major initiative. And then here's the slide showing, and by the way, this is on our website.
where the actually our entire letter to the president is attached, and people can click on that and read it. But essentially, we urge the president to make use of this existing statutory authority, which actually has been in place since 1952, to impose reasonable user fees based on United States public policy, to compel the fossil fuel companies to pay their fair share for being able to continue to utilize the atmosphere for their fossil fuel emissions. So we did not go public immediately with that letter. Instead, we tried behind the scenes to urge the president and his highly talented climate team, which included former Secretary of State John Kerry as the United States' new climate envoy to the international community, and Gina McCarthy, the former administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, who now serves as President Biden's domestic climate advisor. We wanted them to consider taking action under executive authority. And at that time, the president had shown some appetite for being willing to actually utilize executive authority to reverse some of the Trump depredations with respect to environmental protection, including climate. And so we had some realistic hope that that would happen, but it did not, and was not for lack of trying. Of course, the president and his team were exceptionally busy in the beginning of the year with, you know, small hiccups like an attempted insurrection and these sorts of things, and a deadlocked Congress. So on June 1st, we did go public with a op-ed piece in the Boston Globe titled "President Biden should impose a carbon fee immediately under authority of the so-called Independent Office of Appropriations Act of 1952. Now, I should say, you know, we use the term immediately a bit loosely because this can't just be done tomorrow. The president needs to direct the Environmental Protection Agency to undertake rulemaking. And this is important because it means that everyone would have a fair shot at conveying, including the fossil fuel industry, at conveying their thoughts and their concerns about any such program, such implementation of this 1952 statute. But you know, it would be through an administrative process, and we too would have the ability to convey our considered views and thoughts to the Environmental Protection Agency while it was undertaking a rulemaking. But in any event, we went public with this, explaining that the president has the authority to direct the Environmental Protection Agency to commence rulemaking to impose a fee on greenhouse gas emissions. And this would have the effect of no longer treating, giving, you know, special favoritism to greenhouse gas emissions. They should be treated like other wastes and limited. And the atmosphere is a resource that the United States, if any entity within the United States is supposed to protect it should be the US government, and they should be limiting the ability to continue to use the atmosphere as an open sewer. But we also wanted to show broad public support. And so we also commenced through CPR initiative, a petition campaign. Probably everyone, nearly everyone, at least on the webinar today, has signed this. It's still available for signature. Although I should say today, we did convey this to the president and to the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, but we will do so again towards the end of next month to show any additional signatories. But even with, you know, relatively constrained resources, we have been able to over 250 signatories on this. And in order to spread the word, I determined that I really should get out into, even notwithstanding the fact that we were still, and of course still are, suffering through a pandemic, I decided to take it to the streets, so to speak. And initially, I thought perhaps I would cross the country on a powerful electric assist recumbent bicycle, human and electric power. That turned out that trip was a bit star-crossed, and I needed to actually complete it in a van. But as it turns, I was able to speak to groups predominantly at colleges, universities, and law schools from the period September 15th to October 15th. So they included a kickoff event at the University of Oregon School of Law on September 15, and then a speech at the University of Colorado School of Law in Boulder, Colorado. The University of Missouri, Kansas City, actually in their soccer stadium to a enthusiastic crowd at night. At the University of Michigan School of Law in Ann Arbor, Michigan, a talk at the University of Vermont at Burlington, Vermont, and then also at the University at Vermont Law School in South Royalton, Vermont. An audience at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts, and to a group at the Yale University School of Law in New Haven, Connecticut. Then we did a nationwide Zoom call for persons who were interested, but not directly en route. And then to a group at Lionsgate Retirement Community in Voorhees, New Jersey. And finally, a talk at Georgetown University School of Law in Washington, DC. As I said, we have been able to receive the support through our petition from a number of persons. Here I show some of the notable signatories. This is also on our website, including Dr. Hansen, as I said, the Director of Climate Science Awareness and Solutions at Columbia and former Director of the NASA Goddard Institute of Space Studies, and including the former General Counsel of the Environmental Protection Agency, E. Don Elliott, who in 2019 brought to the attention of persons reading an obscure law journal, they included me, the fact that actually EPA has the existing statutory authority to impose carbon fees anytime it has the political will to do so. And a number of other signatories are here as well. You're welcome to have a look to see if you have not yet signed our petition to learn that if you choose to do so, you will be in good company. Okay, here I'm going to take a 2-minute break to let people compose any questions before I move to the next part. And Kaylee, are there any technical problems we need to be concerned with at this time?
Nope, everything seems a-okay so far. We had a question as to how many petition signatories you had to date.
I think we have 768 to date.
Dan, Dan, hi, this is Don
Yeah.
Viviani. I have a question, 2 questions actually. The first is, how can folks help? I mean, in addition to signing the petition, what else can they do? And the other question is, this carbon fee, did you want to explain a little bit how it could easily be revenue neutral, or were you planning on doing that later?
Yeah, I'm going to do that later, but I'll take the first question here, and that is we would like to be able to show increasing numbers, and so if you are interested to do more, you could readily direct some of your friends and colleagues to the CPR initiative website, and when you go there, there's a button at the top to take action, so that people can readily sign the petition. That's one thing, and in addition, as I indicated, we do, and as will become clear as I discuss a couple of more things, we do need to be able to raise some funds in order to be able to prosecute and build out our full program, including the initiative that we're going to begin within a couple of months. And so people can make contributions, and I should indicate, as I may have indicated quickly before, that contributions now are tax deductible. Okay, so let me move to the second part then, because that effort took me through October 16, and then at the very end of October, I did go to Glasgow to participate in the conference. There I actually was able to meet a few colleagues, including John Fitzgerald, who I believe may well be with us on this call. John serves as the Vice President of the Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative, and he's also counsel to Methane Action, which is a very effective small public interest group that is leading the charge nationally and internationally to try to to urge the nations to rapidly reduce methane emissions and concentrations of methane in the atmosphere. COP26, as I tried to indicate in a blog post that we published on Friday, I believe was largely, but not abjectly, a failure. And this is true even though there were a number of headlines brayed across, press releases from, for example, the host nation, the United Kingdom, from Boris Johnson's shop, to some premature headlines, even from environmental organizations, that the nations had achieved a phase out of fossil fuels, including terminating coal as a source of energy and fossil fuel emissions, and entirely ending financing of coal and also oil and gas. And all of this was premature, as I indicated. Wishing it does not make it so. With respect to coal, which is one of the dirtiest fossil fuels, there was an early announcement that by the UK government that 190 countries and organizations had agreed to phase out coal power and end support for new coal plants worldwide. But they cleverly did not give the numbers of organizations and countries. And so while there are roughly 195 or 96 signatories to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN Climate Pact, to say that there's an agreement by 190 countries and organizations, well, that could mean, a very small minority of the countries that are signatories to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And, one will see, if you pay attention to the communications out of each of these COPs, how careful language is crafted, sometimes crafted for the specific purpose of papering over differences. In any event, there was this global coal to clean power transition agreement, and it appears signatories appear to have therefore provided some support to the idea phase out coal power and support for new coal plants. But practically as soon as the ink was dry, there was backpedaling by some of the new signatories to this effort, including Poland and Indonesia. And it's frankly unclear to me what is the actual import of that document when all is said is done. It was said and done. The final communication from COP26 is contained in something called the Glasgow Climate Pact. And there too, with respect to the question of coal, there was a marked, how should I say this, backpedaling of the strong language that was in the draft. And so ultimately, with respect to coal and in a number of other areas, the Glasgow Climate Pact is something of a disappointment. So for example, initially, the pact was going to commit all the nation signatories to it, and all of them have signed it, the Glasgow Climate Pact, committing them to phase out coal-fired power. But the final language, at the insistence of China and India, and then acceded to by all the other countries, merely calls for a phase down of coal. That's still significant because China and India, for example, have been increasing their coal-fired power generation in recent years, including the last 5 years. So that's still a significant public demonstration of willingness, it seems, to turn things around. But it's, what we need is a rapid phase out of all fossil fuel generation. And so at this late stage, a mere phase down is not enough. The same thing is true with respect to some of the other language in the final pact. For example, there is they finally agreed to a phase down in coal power, but they added another weasel word, adjective, unabated coal power. And the question is, what really is unabated coal power? If you were to capture and safely sequester, for example, 40% of emissions, is that coal-fired power plant an abated coal-fired power plant, or is it an unabated coal-fired power plant? Of course, deliberately, there are no definitions. Same thing is true with respect more generally to the category of fossil fuel subsidies. In the Glasgow Climate Pact, there is a commitment to accelerate technologies and policies that are aimed at a transition toward low emission energy systems. Well, just what counts actually as an acceleration aimed at a transition? These are all vague terms that allow for a broad compliance and a broad range of activities that might comply. And then a phase out not of all fossil fuel subsidies, but a phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. I talk a little bit more about this in the blog piece that I wrote last Friday, which is found on our website. So this is not to say that, and I don't want to leave the impression that nothing significant was done. There were a few things that were, I think, fairly significant. One has to do with methane. Methane is a highly potent greenhouse gas that stems not only from fossil fuel burning, but also from agricultural production, famously cows, but also pigs and sheep and so on. Methane, thankfully, degrades in the atmosphere within a couple of decades, but while it is there, it is highly potent, and it's important to accelerate its drawdown and to reduce as much as possible fossil fuel emissions, essentially leakage from fossil fuel production and transportation and so on. And it turns out, according to the scientists, that there are ways of substantially limiting those methane emissions from fossil fuels, and also undertaking different agricultural processes that were emissions, and the global methane pledge was announced during COP26 with the goal of reducing global methane emissions by as much as 30% through readily achievable measures in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, or at least keeping that guardrail within reach. Importantly, at least 100 countries signed on in COP26 to this pledge, but also importantly, they did not include China, Russia, and India. In my view, and I wrote about this a bit in that blog from Friday, this is an important development, but much more is needed, including to research and develop and put in place methods for the removal of excess methane from the atmosphere. And an important advocacy piece was published, I believe, on November 3 in the Washington Post by the scientist Rob Jackson of Stanford and the executive director of Methane Action, Daphne Weisham, and that is also linked in my piece, and I would commend that to your attention to have a read of that. In addition, there was an important declaration by a number of nations, actually 141 nations, on forests and land use. Importantly, this did include Russia and China and India, actually, I didn't put that there, and also the United States, and also Brazil, which is an important nation with respect to considering the potential for so-called natural climate solutions, which nations committed to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. Now, as I also indicated in that blog post from Friday, I think it would have been better had this declaration also obliged nations to halt all deforestation, full stop. It did not do that. Still, however, I think the declaration is strong and potentially useful in a number of nations, including potentially even in the United States, to attempt to argue for a reversal of highly destructive clear cutting of old growth and mature forests, including on public lands. But we could have achieved a lot more, and let's be clear about that. And one of the reasons that we did not achieve a lot more was because neither the United States nor China came prepared with any significant new initiatives that they had actually begun. We'll focus here on the United States. President Biden, of course, upon his inauguration, did rejoin the Paris Agreement to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That was important. He reversed a number, as I said, a number of the Trump depredations on climate and environmental policy more generally. But because of the deadlock in Congress over, particularly in the Senate, over several different policies, including climate, the president was only able to come to Glasgow and talk about the framework agreement that he has secured with some congressional leaders, but not legislation that had actually been passed and was ready for his signature. So he discussed his Build Back Better framework, where there was an agreement among several of the important, but not all of the leaders and central people in the United States Senate and House of Representatives to cut United States greenhouse gas emissions by well over a gigaton by 2030, to allow for an extension, or actually the creation of several new credits for solar panels home weatherization, and lowering energy prices. All aimed, he said, at the goal COP, that the United States would reduce US emissions of greenhouse gases by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by the year 2050. But again, announcing a mere framework does not make it so. So in essence, the president came to Glasgow empty-handed, and I think it showed. And it showed in part, I think, even when the United States and China announced the joint declaration. This was a surprise. And again, it is good that it happened. It is good that, in my opinion, the United States and China are discussing and agreeing to cooperate, particularly given the tensions that has characterized the relationship over the last 2 years, including into the Biden administration. But in this declaration, they announced that they intend to cooperate on a variety of things, including policies to encourage decarbonization and electrification, and also deployment and application of technology such as carbon capture and utilization and storage and direct air capture and the like. These are all good things. But again, announcing vague intentions does not make it so. What really counts, and what all the nations of the world knew would really count, would be whether the United States is the primary emitter of greenhouse gas emissions over time, and China as the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions currently and over the last couple of years, whether they actually are going to make it happen. And that depends on actions at home. Okay, we'll take another couple-minute break. While people, if you have any questions, you can write them in and get your thoughts down. And then we'll proceed to the third and last segment before questions and answers will actually be taken. The difficulty in the United States is not for lack of trying to get something through Congress. It appears that a strong majority of the Democratic caucus, for example, in the Senate, was willing to sign off on the so-called Build Back Better plan, which included a number of climate provisions that the Biden administration was pressing hard for. I wrote about this in one of my earlier blogs that still is on our website if you want to take a look at some of the detailed proposals. And at one point, in fact, the Senate budget reconciliation bill also included a carbon fee, which, according to independent analysis by Resources for the Future, would have been by far the most effective of all the proposals in the so-called Build Back Better plan in terms of actually limiting United States greenhouse gas emissions through the year 2030. But because of the indebtedness of, well, for one, and most importantly, the entire Republican caucus, but also the indebtedness of at least one powerful Democrat, Senator Manchin of West Virginia, who is heavily supported by the fossil fuel industry and actually has his own significant holdings in coal stock. The most important provisions of the reconciliation budget bill have been held up and not here. Thing of great significance will come of the in the area of climate through the Build Back Better plan and the budget reconciliation bill in the Senate. Does that mean then that nothing of significance can proceed? Well, no, it does not mean that. And the reason for that is what is exactly what we have explained to the Biden administration and have been attempting to explain since January. This was the article by E. Don Elliott, the former general counsel of EPA, where he explained in detail that EPA in fact has existing authority to impose a rising carbon fee on oil, gas, and coal. This also is on our website. There has been this presumption that nothing significant could happen at the federal level unless there is new legislation, but that presumes that the Environmental Protection Agency in particular, and the president in general, does not have sufficient existing authority, but it turns out that it does. It is, as I said, the Independent Offices Appropriations Act of 1952, and the terms of that are here. The statute says that the head of any independent agency of the federal government is authorized to prescribe regulations. That's why I said this can't be done tomorrow. It has to be through an administrative process leading to a new rule, a new administrative rule that establishes the charge for a service or a thing of value that is provided to the polluter or to some entity by that agency. That regulation should be that is subject to the policies that are prescribed by the president. They'll be uniform, as practicable and fair, and based on a number of other things, including the value of the service or thing to the recipient, the public policy or interest served, and other relevant facts. And here, the public policy and interest served of the United States is quite clear. We need to, as rapidly as possible, as the Environmental Protection Agency itself has observed, eliminate fossil fuel emissions, or at least ensure that they are safely contained in the environment and kept from the atmosphere and from the oceans. And is the ability to continue to pollute the atmosphere, at least for a time, a thing of value to the fossil fuel industry? You better believe it. And there's no particular reason why that valuable service or thing of value should continue to be given away for free to the fossil fuel industry. And the statute says that it should not be. So here, while the term fossil fuel emissions or greenhouse gas emissions are not mentioned, this is a more general statute. The statute clearly applies to, in our legal view, to fossil fuel emissions, and it is right and appropriate and consistent with the United States policy for the United States to impose a rising fee on oil, gas, and coal emissions, sufficient to phase them out over the next several years. And if that were done, then we would be addressing what the president aptly himself called the existential climate threat. If this is an existential risk, then we should act like it. And so our petition to the president respectfully urges him to utilize his full executive authority to rapidly phase out those emissions, and so to direct EPA to impose a rising fee on fossil fuels. That has been our campaign to date, our first major initiative. We have had some traction in that when we first commenced it, we did not then have direct communications, but now we are in direct communications with the White House and EPA. And we would like to step it up even further by amplifying our reach, securing not mere hundreds, but thousands of and on the call certainly can help with that. Okay. I'll take another 2-minute break here for people to send in any questions, and then we'll go to our final segment. Kaylee, any technical problems?
No, everything looks good. Did you want to take a question now or wait till the end?
Let's wait till the end because this last part is going to be quite quick, but I want to introduce it so as not to forget it, actually.
Okay.
Okay, and so I talked about the fact that we formed Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative to pursue several initiatives, but spoke only specifically about our first major initiative. That is because the Initiative 2, Initiative 3 were still in development. We are, I want to note here that we are near the point where we will be initiating our second major initiative. And just as necessary background, I can't yet talk in detail about this, but as necessary background, our current crisis stems from 2 global physical facts. The first is that we have yet to phase out, that is existing, continuing, and new emissions of fossil fuel. And so we continue to be emitting carbon dioxide, methane, and the rest of the greenhouse gas emissions stemming from fossil fuels and other sources at a far too high rate. But the second problem is that we have already overburdened the atmosphere, especially with carbon dioxide, so that even if we were to be able to commence a phase out of emissions, there's still the problem of older or legacy emissions to deal with. We need to both phase out all new emissions and also remove a substantial portion of legacy emissions if we are going to return the atmospheric concentration of the critical greenhouse gas emissions to a level that is not dangerous. We've already overshot the safe level of atmospheric CO2 and CO2 equivalent emissions. We need to actually remove a substantial portion of the overburden. And this second major initiative will target both sources, both new fossil fuel emissions and legacy emissions under existing statutory authority, looking at yet another important statute. So we will have more details within a few weeks, certainly by sometime in January. And when we file that, we will have yet another webinar where people can ask questions about the details of our filing, and also can ask questions about how they might get involved. So anyhow, that completes the formal part of my presentation of this webinar, and happy to turn to questions and answers. Oh yeah, but I should note as well here, again, in response to a question that Don Viviani asked, we are going to do an end of the year fundraising drive, but if people are interested in preempting that and making a generous donation, that is possible today at this link that's shown on your screen at the bottom. And as I indicated, contributions are tax deductible. Okay, so Kaylee, could you help us now? I'm going to stop the share of the screen, unless people need me to go back to one of the slides. And Kaylee, could you help us Could you help field some of the questions and in any way you wish?
Yes, we have a question from one of the attendees. I would let her ask it over audio, but she didn't indicate if she wanted to, so I'll just ask you. She was asking what has worked in the past to help compel countries to stick to their pledges, and what do you think will work in the future?
Well, okay, this is a significant issue. And it turns out, and I wrote about this a little bit on the blog on Friday, that we have a significant gap between two things, between pledges, they're often called nationally determined contributions, and actions. And then we have a second gap between the pledges, even if they were fully honored, and what is needed to stay within the 1.5 degree above pre-industrial level global warming limit that is set in the Paris Agreement and referred to in subsequent analysis by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the first, how can you ensure that nations honor their commitments? This is done. This is not being done yet effectively. I will say that litigation is possible. Dr. Hansen and I, for example, intervened to assist a public interest group in attempting to enforce Colombia's nationally determined contribution, where we sued the government on the basis that their continued logging, destruction of the northern Amazon rainforest was inconsistent with their nationally determined contribution, their commitment to phase out logging and stop deforestation of the Amazon, and we helped win that case. So. It is possible to bring enforcement actions, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, to ensure that nations honor the commitment. But beyond that, it's a question of international opprobrium that affixes to violations of commitments. When the United States, let's take a look at our own country. When Trump got in to the presidency, he immediately announced his decision to exit from the Paris Agreement to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, falsely asserting that the Paris Agreement was disadvantageous to the United States, disadvantaged the United States more than other nations. It was absolutely not true. But of course, one in I presume 60,000 lies that he told over the ensuing 4 years. But the framers of the Paris Accord, including the prior Obama administration, had ensured that a country could not entirely exit the Paris Agreement for 4 years. And so by the time that Joe Biden was elected, the withdrawal from the Paris Accord was still not complete. And of course, President Biden then immediately reversed the decision to exit the Paris Agreement and announced our commitment to stay, thankfully. But there was nothing that other nations did to inflict any penalty upon the United States. That's not to say that there are not things that in theory could be done. So for example, the European Union recently announced that it was going to impose border tariffs on nations that have not, whose commitments do not rise to their level as they see as necessary. And some people in Congress have expressed some interest in also using border tariff adjustments for a similar purpose, assuming that the United States were also to have a significant decarbonization program, so as to ensure not merely that nations are upholding their commitments, but that nations are not under committing. So these are two aspects of the problem. They're interrelated. And here you see, with respect to the Biden administration, that the Biden administration has committed to something significant in terms of our revised nationally determined contribution. And yet he has been unable to deliver, to be able to show a set of new policy instruments through Congress. And so our proposal then to the president to impose a rising carbon fee on oil, gas, and coal through existing statutory authority would actually enable the United States to meet the commitment that it has already publicly announced to slash emissions by at least 50% by the year 2030. So the question is right, and it's important, and it is it's a bit complicated. I hope that was helpful, though. Next, Kaylee.
We had some comments from John Fitzgerald, but then he had to leave before I could give him audio. So I thought I would allow you to answer the next question before maybe you'd want to read John Fitzgerald's comments or respond to them. But we have another question from an attendee asking, what are the most important factors to making the EPA carbon fee happen? And what is the White House and EPA waiting for? What is blocking their path on this?
I can't say exactly what is blocking their path on this, other than that I think that their thought is that if they were able to get something through Congress, that would be the more direct route, because if Congress passed the statute that was sufficiently clear and unambiguous, it would be more impervious to challenge in court than a new interpretation of the 1952 statute. And so, I think I'm making an argument for them, but that's what I would argue if I were them. And by the way, that is not a analysis that I would disagree with. I mean, if a equivalently strong decarbonization measure could get through Congress, then I think we certainly would prefer that to an exercise of existing executive authority that required a rulemaking. But the point is, Congress has been and appears to continue to be deadlocked. We are in a crisis, and this clear avenue and authority should not go untapped. We should utilize it. But that's my answer. I think that they have been focused on Congress because it seemed to be the most straightforward, and I think they believed that they were able to get it through Congress. And they, despite the fact that the president has great experience, and so do many of his staff, in lawmaking, I think they miscalculated, in particular, the degree to which Senator Manchin was indebted to the fossil fuel companies, the degree to which the Republicans would hold as a block against the president's entire agenda as encapsulated in the so-called Build Back Better plan in the House and in the budget reconciliation bill in the Senate. And And then I think they did not predict, perhaps no one at all could have predicted what Senator Sinema has been doing over the last 2 months. We'd have to have an entire webinar to attempt even to explain that, and I don't wish to do that. So there is, I think that they reasonably believe that they would have an easier path to implement the major pieces of the president's agenda. Sorry for that. Next, Kaylee.
Lastly, we just had the comments from John Fitzgerald.
Actually, Dan, can I ask a question concerning that last piece?
Sure.
In the Independent Office Appropriations Act, there were 4 things listed as reasons why an executive agency could levy a fee. And I mean, the last one was just and other factors that apply, but the 2 middle ones were benefit to the recipient or the person that they levy the fee on, and the third one was benefit to the public. Do both of those have to be do both of those have to be the basis of the fee, or can just one of them be the basis of the fee? And as far as the value to the recipient is concerned, does the fee have to be equal to the value of the recipient to the recipient?
Right. I think those are questions. The last questions I think are untested, but I think that the agency has considerable discretion as to how to weight the various factors.
Okay.
And particularly where the interest of the country is so overwhelming, I think a good argument can be made that the fee to be charged to the polluter here, the fossil fuel companies, is not necessarily the limit of the fee, but in point of fact and in practical terms, the fee would take a bite, according to a number of analyses, including by the International Monetary Fund, which Dr. Hansen and I cite to in our letter to the president. There would be a significant impact, even with a carbon fee of only $75 a metric ton. And as you know, Don, $75 a ton of CO2 emissions does not come close to the true social cost of carbon pollution. Which could be, according to which economists' analysis you look at, could be, upwards of $500 a metric ton. So even if the value to the fossil fuel company is still a lot higher than the fee that would be charged, there would be no problem with that. I think the only problem would be if the fossil fuel company could argue that they were being charged more than the value, and of course, if they were being charged more than the value of the ability to continue to pollute, well, then they could just switch to non-fossil fuel generation, which is exactly what needs to happen. So
that's how the free market's supposed to work.
Exactly, and the problem here is that fossil fuel emissions have not had to pay anything close to the imposition that they were to the damage that they have been imposing on the environment, future generations, and so on. So any way you look at it, a reasonable fee should be high, should probably, in my opinion, not compel an immediate phase out, but should compel a phase out within a limited amount of time. And that would be quite fair when looking at all of the factors. Now, and I see here, Kaylee, that John Fitzgerald also reminds us of John's suggestion as well. The fee could be made revenue neutral, but in my opinion, that would require a separate act of Congress. So the fee could be imposed under the Independent Office Appropriations Act. I'm not 100% sure of this, but I do believe that this is the case, that it may be that the Independent Offices Appropriations Act could authorize the fee, but in terms of whether the fee then could be refunded, for example, on a per capita basis through a dividend, that may well require an act of Congress. But I'm not fully sure of that. I haven't scoured the in terms of see if they have an authority to make that decision on the basis of the president's policies, but it may well be that would require a subsequent act of Congress. But that would be quite easy compared to the imposition, the decision to actually impose a reasonable fee on the fossil fuel companies. That's the difficult part, and the rest I think would be quite easy, because many members of Congress would be quite eager, I think, to provide at least a substantial share of revenue, if not all of the revenue that would be received, back to ensure that ratepayers and energy users, citizens, are not in any way disadvantaged. And studies established that a full fee and dividend program would actually return more to the bottom 2/3 of the income distribution than they would lose in terms of rising energy costs. And the reason for that is that the wealthy people, wealthy households use a substantially disproportionate amount of energy compared to lower income and poor households. And the reason for that is that they tend to live in larger houses, they tend to fly more, they tend to drive bigger vehicles. And and so for the wealthy in our nation, well, they may end up having to pay a bit more in terms of higher energy costs than they would receive in a per capita dividend. But that's okay, because they can afford it. John also asks, John also points out that there are several steps to make pledges enforceable, and it's not always successful. And I agree with that. And I noted that there are several ways beyond just the normal legislative process, democratic process, but there are several other ways, including the potential for strategic litigation, to compel a country to honor its international commitments. And then, of course, there are also possibilities that other countries could impose carbon tariffs on a nation that was not pulling its fair share weight in terms of its international commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, over which it has some control. Okay, any others that I've missed here, Kaylee?
No, you got all of them.
Okay, Don, Kaylee, do you have any more questions? Or Don, have you any more questions?
No.
Or comments? Okay. Okay,
Thank you,
well,
Jen.
everyone, thank you very much. Thank you, Kaylee. Thank you, Don. Thank you, everyone, for getting on. Thanks for those of you who sent in questions, and we will be in touch as we proceed. We really appreciate everyone's contributions and support of what we are trying to do here, and we will keep you apprised. Take care.